the general who was betrayed by his own empire and built a new one. He wasn't born a prince. He wasn't born into riches, legacy, or divine right. But from the moment he took his first breath, there was something about him that made kings uneasy. They say the gods whispered when he was born, not in blessing, but in warning. Because this boy, whose name would one day echo through war rooms and history books, wasn't just destined for greatness, he was destined for vengeance. His name was Aurelian Marcellus. And at just 17, he was commanding more respect on the battlefield than men twice his age. The empire of Cassia had grown fat and lazy. What was once a sharp, disciplined war machine had become a bloated aristocracy of gold-plated honor and whispered conspiracies. But the front lines were still real, the enemies were still real, and that's where Aurelian thrived, on the bloodied soil, sword in hand, leading charges when senators back home debated in velvet robes about moral victories. He rose fast, too fast. By 26, he was already a general, not because of family, not because of wealth, but because when Aurelian gave an order, men obeyed, and when Aurelian entered battle, the gods seemed to watch. The emperor, Lucan IV, saw in Aurelian a tool, brilliant, loyal, and dangerously efficient. He sent him to crush rebellions that other generals failed to control. He made him the face of campaigns, paraded his victories through the capital, crowned him the savior of the southern gates. But behind that praise was fear, because Aurelian was beloved, not just by soldiers, but by the people. Commoners named their sons after him. Statues of the emperor were being replaced with likenesses of the general. And in a palace built on paranoia, adoration was more threatening than treason. Still, Aurelian remained faithful. He didn't want the throne. He didn't want the palace. He only wanted to serve the empire he believed in. That was his fatal flaw. He believed too much. Because while he was spilling blood in distant provinces, the court back home was plotting. Whispers became rumors. Rumors became accusations. That he was building a private army. That he was too close to the merchant guilds. That he was positioning himself as a rival to the emperor's heir. Lies, all of them. But in a system where fear was the currency of power, truth mattered less than perception. When the betrayal came, it wasn't with a sword. It was with a sealed letter. Aurelian had just returned from a brutal winter campaign against the mountain clans of the northern ridge, a campaign no one expected him to survive. His face was weathered, his armor battered, but his eyes burned with the fire of a man who refused to die. As he dismounted in the capital, the crowds erupted into cheers. Flowers were thrown. Old women kissed his hand. Children chased after his horse, calling his name. And waiting for him at the gates was a royal envoy. The letter bore the imperial seal. Aurelian opened it with bloody fingers. His expression never changed, not when he read the words, not when they accused him of treason, not when they stripped him of his command. Not even when the last line declared him banished, exiled to the eastern wastes under threat of execution if he ever returned. He folded the letter, looked to the horizon, and said nothing. But inside, something shattered. Aurelian didn't plead. He didn't resist. He gathered what few loyal men remained, not the politicians, not the flattering nobles, but the grizzled veterans who had marched beside him through hell and worse. And he left. No parade this time, no music, just silence. And as the capital disappeared behind him, he knew the empire had made a mistake. Because they hadn't banished a traitor. They had forged a new enemy. The eastern wastes were more myth than geography. A land of desert storms, nomadic tribes, cursed ruins, and unforgiving gods. The kind of place the empire sent its monsters and martyrs. But Aurelian saw something else. He saw freedom. Not the kind bought by coins or decreed by emperors. The kind carved from dust and ash with bare hands. If the empire didn't want him, he'd build something stronger. At first, the tribes mocked him, a city general with soft hands and no horse, but Aurelian didn't bring luxury. He brought war tactics, survival discipline, and above all, respect. He learned their language. He rode their horses. He bled with them in raids against bandits, defended their water wells, helped rebuild their shattered temples. And slowly, one by one, the tribes bent the knee, not out of fear, but honor. They called him Shakar Varun. The fire returned. He wasn't just a leader now. He was legend. And legends, when betrayed, become dangerous. Years passed. The empire forgot about him, or so they thought. But while they were busy fighting each other in courtrooms and bedchambers, Aurelian was uniting the East, fortress by fortress, alliance by alliance. He didn't seek vengeance. He sought justice. He wasn't going to march back into the empire to reclaim favor. He was going to burn down the house that tried to erase him and build something better in its ashes. And then the moment came. The empire made a mistake, one they wouldn't survive. A border city fell, not to invaders, but to famine. The emperor's envoys asked the eastern wastes for aid, not knowing who now ruled them, not realizing the man they had betrayed was now the only hope they had. Aurelian sent wagons of grain, medicine, engineers, but not under the empire's flag, his own. The people saw it, the soldiers saw it, the senators back home panicked. They tried to spin it, call him a rogue warlord, a usurper. But truth moves faster than propaganda when it's carried on grateful tongues. The empire had betrayed its greatest general, and now that general was saving the empire's people more than the crown ever did. That's when the letters started arriving, secret ones, from governors, generals, even old enemies. They asked for meetings, negotiations, protection. They weren't pledging loyalty to the crown anymore. They were pledging loyalty to the man the crown betrayed. Aurelian read each letter silently, and with every word, he understood one thing more clearly. They had exiled him to kill his name. But in doing so, they made him immortal. By the time the empire realized what it had created, it was already too late. Aurelian had stopped being a name. He had become an idea, and ideas are harder to kill than men. While the emperor and his court sharpened daggers behind velvet curtains, Aurelian sharpened minds. He trained warriors, governors, spies, diplomats. He didn't just build an army. He built a system, one that didn't depend on bloodlines or birthright, but on strength, honor, and loyalty earned through action. And that system had already begun to seep into the cracks of a rotting empire. The War of Shadows didn't begin with armies. It began with whispers. In the northern provinces, tax collectors were turning up dead. Not robbed, just executed and left with a black sigil branded on their foreheads, a phoenix rising from chains. In the west, garrisons woke to find their weapons stolen, their officers poisoned, their banners burned. But there was no army in sight, no declarations, just silence and fear, because no one knew who was behind it, only that someone was unmaking the empire piece by piece, someone who knew its weaknesses too well. Aurelian never signed his name, never gave speeches, never claimed responsibility. But everyone knew. He was dismantling the empire not with brute force, but precision, like a surgeon, not a conqueror, cutting arteries, starving limbs, crippling the machine from within until it collapsed under its own weight. He had spent years inside it. He knew every rot, every blind spot. And now he was turning that knowledge into a weapon. The emperor, desperate to maintain control, turned paranoid. He began purging his own court, accusing anyone who spoke Aurelian's name with reverence of treason. Senators were dragged from chambers in the night. Generals who had once fought beside Aurelian were demoted, imprisoned, or executed. It only made things worse. Because now, even loyalists began to wonder, What if the wrong side had won? Meanwhile, Aurelian's eastern capital, a city he built from the dust with his own hands, had become a beacon. Traders spoke of roads that were safer under his law than any imperial highway. Philosophers and scribes from across the desert came to teach in schools funded by his war chest. Former enemies now guarded his walls. And the people? They didn't fear him. They revered him. Not as a tyrant, but as the one man who had stood against an empire and survived. But Aurelian was not content with survival. He had tasted what justice could look like. Now he wanted to deliver it. He began sending messages, quiet but clear, to former allies within the empire. Not ultimatums, not demands, just questions. What are you fighting for? Who are you dying for? And when your children inherit this world, will they thank you for the empire you defended, or curse you for the one you refused to change? Some ignored him. Some resisted. But more than a few answered. And with every new answer, another crack split across the empire's foundation. And then came the breaking point. The emperor's only son, Prince Calidus, was captured by rebels in the frontier. Aurelian didn't stage the ambush. He didn't order the attack. But the rebels knew who to call. They sent word to the eastern capital, and Aurelian answered. He could have used the boy as a bargaining chip, as leverage, as a trophy. But instead, he did something no one expected. He freed him, fed him, gave him clean clothes, no speeches, no threats, just one conversation. In a quiet garden, under the flickering torchlight, Aurelian looked the boy in the eye and said, "Your father fears me because he thinks I want his throne. I don't. I want something far more dangerous, a future your people can believe in." And then he sent the prince home, alive, unmarked, and thoughtful. That single act shattered the illusion of imperial righteousness. Calidus returned changed, quiet, observant, and most dangerous of all, conflicted. He didn't speak of what was said, but the change was visible. He stopped attending court, refused to endorse new purges, began funding food caravans to starving provinces through unofficial channels. The emperor saw the signs. He saw his own son slipping away, and he panicked. He declared total war, not just against Aurelian, but against any province, tribe, or noble suspected of aiding him. Villages were burned, books outlawed, trade routes blockaded, entire cities were placed under martial law. The empire was bleeding itself dry to destroy a ghost, because that's what Aurelian had become, a ghost of justice, a ghost of betrayal, a ghost that haunted every general who had once called him brother. But Aurelian wasn't hiding anymore. He knew war was inevitable, and he wasn't going to wait for it. He was going to choose the battlefield. He sent a single message, written in the empire's own dialect, sealed in the black wax of his eastern kingdom. To Emperor Lucan IV, you created me. Now come and face me. The capital erupted in chaos. Some demanded an immediate march, others urged caution. The Senate was split, but Lucan, driven by pride and fear, took the bait. He gathered what was left of the imperial legions, veterans, mercenaries, fanatics, and marched east. And waiting for him at the edge of the Red Basin was a sight no one expected. Aurelian's army wasn't made of savages or deserters. It was organized, disciplined, thousands strong, formations honed to perfection, armored cavalry, archers in rows, siege weapons carved from stolen imperial blueprints. But most terrifying of all, silence. They didn't cheer. They didn't chant. They just stood, waiting. Lucan's army hesitated. They saw something they had never seen before. Unity. And in the center, atop a black stallion, stood the man they had betrayed, not as a ghost anymore, but as a king. The battle didn't begin with horns. It began with footsteps, precise, calculated. Aurelian had waited years for this moment, not for revenge, but to prove a point. That loyalty isn't given, it's earned. That power isn't taken, it's built. That empires don't fall from force. They crumble from within. The two armies clashed in what would later be known as the Day of Cinders. And as steel met steel, Aurelian never once lost focus. He wasn't just fighting to win. He was fighting to show the world what betrayal costs and what courage restores. By nightfall, the battlefield was quiet. Fires smoldered in the distance. The imperial banner lay torn in the mud. Lucan's army had broken. And the emperor? He was gone. No one knew if he had fled or died. It didn't matter. Because in the silence that followed, something else rose. Not a new empire, not a new tyranny, but a new beginning. In the aftermath of war, the world always holds its breath. Not for peace. Peace is a myth sold by tired diplomats. But for what comes next. And when the smoke cleared over the Red Basin, it wasn't just a battlefield that had changed. It was the future. The empire, that ancient beast of marble columns and velvet lies, was broken. Not just defeated, but discredited. Its illusion shattered, its grip loosened. And where its banner once flew, now rose another. But Aurelian didn't march into the capital. He didn't crown himself emperor. He didn't demand worship or tribute or titles. He returned to the east, to the city he built from sand and betrayal. He sat on no golden throne, wore no laurel crown. Instead, he met with farmers, architects, scribes. He held councils, not courts. Because he knew real power wasn't built on fear. It was built on belief. And the people believed. They came from across every border. Former imperial soldiers laying down their swords to plant olive trees. Traders burning their old contracts and swearing loyalty to the new order. Mothers naming their children not after kings, but after rebels who had stood their ground. This wasn't an empire. It was a movement, a wave of truth born from fire. But that didn't mean it was safe, because every revolution births 1,000 enemies, some outside, many within. And as Aurelian's influence grew, so did the shadows. Whispers returned. Some said he was becoming what he once hated, that he was too powerful, too admired, too unchallenged. Others feared the vacuum his mercy created. Bandits now dressed as rebels. Warlords claimed they fought under his name, while enslaving the same villages he once swore to protect. And within his own council, cracks began to form. Men who had once followed him in exile now argued in polished chambers. Ambition, it seemed, was harder to kill than emperors. Aurelian watched it all. He said little. But he understood one brutal truth. The war had been easy. It was the peace that would break him. And this, right here, is where I, Uncle Luke, need to ask you something. If you're still listening to this, still following this story of betrayal and rebellion and power reborn, don't forget to like this video, drop your thoughts in the comments, and hit that subscribe button. These aren't just stories, these are warnings, blueprints, legends buried in plain sight, and we've got many more to uncover. Now let's get back to it. Because while the new world was being carved, the old one wasn't dead yet. Far to the west, remnants of the empire had retreated into exile. Noble houses, military orders, wealthy merchants. They saw Aurelian not as a liberator, but as a threat to their legacy. And from these ruins they plotted, quietly, carefully, not with armies but with influence. They bribed his governors, funded rogue militias, spread false decrees in his name. They didn't need to fight him on the battlefield. They just needed to make him doubt himself. And it worked. Aurelian began questioning his own advisors. Policies slowed. Trade routes collapsed under suspicion. Factions emerged. The hardliners, who believed Aurelian should take the imperial capital and crush what remained. And the dreamers, who begged him to hold the line of peace, even if it cost him control. The city, once united under vision, was now split by fear. And then came the final blow. The boy. Not a prince, not a soldier, a street urchin, barely 12. He approached the palace gates with a letter and a blade. He didn't make it past the first guard. But the message, that reached Aurelian. It was simple. You gave us hope, and now you give us silence. The boy had carved it into his skin. Aurelian didn't speak for hours. He just stared at the letter, at the blood, at the failure. Because for the first time since his exile, he realized something terrifying. He was losing the very people he rose for, not from betrayal, from hesitation. So he stood, and he made a choice. He gathered his council, his generals, his people, and for the first time in years, he raised his voice. I will not become a tyrant, but I will not let cowards rewrite the future. We did not bleed to replace a crown with silence. We did not rise to fear our own power. The world we want will not be given to us. We must take it, not with chains, but with fire. The crowd roared. His army marched once more, not to conquer, to finish what betrayal had started. And so, with the sun rising over the eastern hills, Aurelian, the man who had once been cast out with nothing but a sword and a wound in his heart, now led a people who would follow him to the end of the world. Because he didn't just rise. He built something worth rising for. The capital had always stood like a god watching the world. Marble towers, golden domes, statues of emperors carved so high they pierced the clouds. It had survived plagues, riots, revolutions, assassinations. But it had never faced Aurelian. He didn't march with fury. He marched with purpose. His banner, the phoenix rising from chains, now flew across half the continent. Cities didn't resist him. They opened their gates. Villages lit torches in his name. Even former imperial commanders sent him letters swearing fealty before his army even arrived. He was not a general anymore. He was inevitability. Inside the capital, fear spread faster than orders. The High Council convened emergency sessions every night, tearing over old laws, ancient rights, trying to find something, anything, that could stop him. But they knew, everyone knew. The man they betrayed had returned, and this time, he wasn't knocking. He was coming to collect. But the streets weren't silent. They were watching. The people remembered him. The soldiers remembered him. The old women who once threw him flowers still whispered his name. The children who once chased his horse were now grown. And waiting. For justice. For reckoning. For something more than the crown's rusted promises. And then came the message. Delivered by a rider wearing no armor, no insignia. Just a letter, and eyes that burned with certainty. The message was addressed to the keepers of the golden crown. It read, You made a king out of fear. I made a kingdom out of ruin. You turned your back on your people. I bled with mine. I do not come for your thrones. I come for your lies. Lay them down, or I will tear them from the stone. The next morning, half the council resigned. 2 members vanished. One was found in the river, pockets full of stones. Aurelian didn't wait. His army encircled the city in silence. No catapults, no siege towers. He had no need. The gates opened on their own. The people let him in. They lined the streets not in chains, but in awe. Flowers were tossed again, not out of fear, but recognition. This wasn't a conqueror arriving. It was the return of someone who had never truly left their hearts. And yet, at the heart of the city, the golden crown still stood. A relic, a symbol. The imperial palace, that sprawling fortress of decadence and secrets, loomed like a dying god clinging to its last breath. Inside, the remaining loyalists waited, not to defend the empire, but to protect their power. The confrontation wasn't loud. There were no blood-soaked battles in the throne room, no cinematic duels, just one man walking through a hall of cowards. Aurelian stepped into the chamber where once he had been condemned, where senators whispered betrayal behind goblets of wine, where they banished him for being too loyal, too admired, too dangerous to their illusion. Now they cowered in their robes, faces pale, voices shaking. But Aurelian didn't raise a sword. He raised his voice. You ruled with fear. I lead with memory. You built a cage. I built a fire. You forgot your people. I became one of them. Your reign ends not with rebellion, it ends with remembrance. He didn't take the throne. He destroyed it. With his own hands, he ripped the golden crown from its pedestal, not to wear it, but to crush it, to show that no man needed symbols to lead, just truth, just vision, just the will to never forget where he came from. And when the stone shattered beneath the weight of that crown, the people outside cheered. Because the empire had not fallen. It had finally been freed. But freedom, as always, comes at a cost. Aurelian didn't rest. He didn't bask in glory. He walked through the streets, speaking with blacksmiths, fishermen, teachers, asking what they needed, what they dreamed of, what they feared. He understood what the empire never did, that ruling is not about ruling. It's about listening. He rebuilt schools first, then roads. He opened courts that even beggars could walk into. He gave land to the families of soldiers lost in wars they never chose. He burned the old tax ledgers, forgave debts, named scholars and merchants to his new council, not generals. He didn't call it an empire. He called it the Republic of the Phoenix. It wasn't perfect. No new world ever is. There were still enemies, still plots, still those who missed the old days of gold and control. But now, the people were watching. And for the first time in generations, they had someone worth believing in. Aurelian never took a title, never crowned himself king or emperor. To his people, he was simply called the Returned. He lived simply, died quietly. No tomb of gold, no towering statue. Just a stone in the east that reads, he was betrayed, he built better. And that is why we still speak his name. Not because he won a war, but because he proved betrayal doesn't have to end a man. Sometimes it begins a new world. Time is cruel to heroes. Statues crumble. Stories get rewritten. And even the brightest flames fade under the dust of new wars, new rulers, new agendas. But somehow Aurelian's name survived. Not because of his power, or the cities he built, or the empire he shattered, but because of the people. They carried his story like fire in their veins, whispering it across generations, not as myth, but as warning. He had no sons, no royal line, no bloodline to protect his legacy. That was by design. He once said, "A crown built on blood turns to rust. A future built on memory can never be erased." So he left no heirs, only ideas. And ideas, when they catch, can burn down a world or light a new one. The Republic of the Phoenix endured. For decades it held, roads were maintained, schools taught not just obedience, but thought. Markets flourished, armies shrank, diplomats replaced generals, and in every village, from the Red Basin to the Stone Valleys, one name was spoken with reverence. Not because it was forced, but because it was earned. Aurelian. But no golden age lasts forever. Years after his death, as new voices rose and new problems emerged, cracks began to show. A drought led to food riots. A border skirmish reignited old grudges. Factions reformed, not unlike the ones Aurelian had silenced long ago. And some began to ask, was his dream too idealistic? Too fragile for the real world? They argued in court halls and town squares. Some said his republic needed stronger rule. Others clung to the vision he left behind. And in that chaos, one man stood in the middle. A young historian named Cato Verdanus, born in the shadow of Aurelian's final days. Cato didn't seek fame. He wasn't a warrior. But he was obsessed with one question. Why had the empire failed? And how did Aurelian succeed where so many others had fallen? He began collecting stories, not from officials, but from shepherds, medics, retired scouts. He walked the roads Aurelian had built, read the letters that had survived, visited the stone that marked his grave, and the deeper he went, the more he understood. Aurelian hadn't saved the world. He had given it a second chance, and it was up to the next generation to decide what to do with it. Cato wrote a book. Not grand, not poetic, just a simple title, The General Who Was Betrayed by His Own Empire. It didn't sell well at first, too political, they said, too idealistic. But word spread, because truth, real truth, has a way of surviving censors. The book made its way into schools, then libraries, then into the hands of young leaders who felt disillusioned by the rising chaos. They didn't see Aurelian as a myth. They saw him as a blueprint. And soon, whispers returned. But this time, they weren't of war. They were of rebuilding. One governor abolished noble privileges. Another redirected military funding to rebuild flood barriers. A general refused to execute political prisoners and cited Aurelian's code. Slowly, almost quietly, the Republic began to breathe again. But the world outside had changed. New empires had risen, powerful and hungry. One, from across the southern seas, began invading border provinces, claiming ancient rights. They expected resistance. They expected soldiers. They didn't expect the people. Entire towns rose without waiting for orders. Former farmers strategized defenses based on Aurelian's old war teachings. Women led patrols. Children ran messages. They defended not a flag, but a memory, a way of life, the belief that they could be more than what history demanded. The invading empire was stunned. Their generals wrote back in disbelief. These people fight as if they've already won, because they had something the invaders didn't. A story, a legacy, and in the capital, where marble had replaced blood, the council voted unanimously to name the rebuilt center of government the Hall of Aurelian. Inside its stone archways now stands a single statue, not of a man holding a sword, but a man standing tall, one hand extended, not in command, but in invitation. At the base, a quote is carved in 27 languages. "Betrayal made me a rebel. Memory made me a builder. You must choose which one to become." And under that, in letters so small you must stand close to read them, Uncle Luke told you. No legend rises without pain. But the right kind of pain changes everything. And that's why we still tell his story. Because in every corner of the world, someone is being betrayed. Someone is being cast out for being too brave, too honest, too different. And somewhere, in the quiet, they're choosing to fall or to rise. So if you're hearing this now, sitting in the dark, wondering what your betrayal means, remember Aurelian. He didn't need a crown to change the world. He just needed the will to start again. And if you're ready to keep hearing stories like this, stories the world tried to bury but we keep digging back up, then like, comment, and subscribe to Uncle Luke Tells, because there's always more. And the next one might just be yours.